I'm Angela Willis and welcome to my channel. I'm a history teacher and I like to use murder cases to help people better understand history. In today's episode of Women That Kill, we look at 19-year-old slave named Celia who killed her 65-year-old master in 1855. The murder occurred in Missouri during the Bleeding Kansas period. This case helps us understand what slavery was like for women and how politics influenced slaves' daily lives. Celia was born in 1836 in Missouri. This was 16 years after the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri to the U.S. as a slave state, while banning slavery from the rest of the Western Territory. This made it hard to maintain slavery in Missouri because it was easy for slaves to escape to freedom, especially since Missouri has a lot of rivers that could be used by runaway slaves to get to freedom. So at age 14, Celia was purchased by Robert Newsom, who owned a 800-acre farm in nearby Callaway County. Newsom lived on the farm with his two adult daughters, Virginia and Mary, and grandchildren. He owned 5 male slaves, and Celia was the only female slave. She was given her own cabin on Newsom's farm near the fruit trees. Her daily job was to cook and clean the master's house. On the same night Celia came to live on the farm, Newsom raped her. She was 14 and he was 60 years old. He forced Celia into a sexual relationship with him. Over the course of 5 years, Celia and Newsom had one son together, who was born a slave. Children born from a black female slave and a white man, usually the slave owner, were called children of the plantation. These children were considered slaves because their mothers were slaves. They were usually treated better than the other slaves, so most likely Celia's son was treated well, but Celia was not happy with the relationship between her and the master, but she dealt with it. And she dealt with it for 5 years. So what changed? What caused Celia to snap? Well, after 5 years of being in a relationship with the master, Celia met a young male slave on Newsom's farm named George. In secret, Celia and George began to see each other. On occasion, George stayed at Celia's cabin when the master was not there. By the winter of 1855, Celia became pregnant. She did not know who the father was, but she told George she was pregnant. To her surprise, George was happy about the pregnancy, but George told Celia that he would have nothing more to do with her if she did not quit having sex with the master. George put Celia in a very difficult situation. She wasn't having sex with the master because she wanted to. The rape of female slaves was widespread during this period. At this time, enslaved black women legally could not own their own bodies or withhold consent. Nevertheless, Celia was desperate to save her relationship with George, so she tried to end the relationship with the master. She turned to anyone who could help her. She even approached Newsom's daughters. She asked for their help in getting their father to quit forcing her to have sex with him. Likely, Newsom's daughters did not try to help Celia. During slavery, Southern white women understood that their husbands and fathers were most likely having sex with the slaves. It was part of slavery. White women had no control over the sexual relationships between white male slave owners and the female slaves. No one could help Celia. On the night of the murder, out of desperation to save her relationship with George, Celia went to the master. Robert Newsom was sitting in the kitchen at a table reading the newspaper. Celia begged him to leave her alone, at least while she was pregnant. In response, Newsom lowered the paper just enough to look at Celia and said he was coming over to her cabin that night. This enraged Celia. She told him, "Do not come to my cabin." Then she went home. Celia sat in a chair in her cabin watching the door. Around 9 p.m., the door handle turned and in stepped Newsom. He told her it was time for sex and moved towards her. Celia grabbed a heavy piece of wood and hit him in the head. Newsom fell to the floor. Celia used all her strength to hit him in the head a second time, killing him, or so she thought. There is no way to confirm if Newsom was dead or knocked out after being hit the second time. Celia didn't waste much time. She built a raging fire in the hearth, dragged Newsom's body over and pushed it into the flames. By the early morning hours, Newsom had turned into ash and bone. Celia gathered up the pieces of bone and used rocks to smash them. Then she went to bed. In the morning, Celia got Newsom's 12-year-old grandson to shovel the ashes from her fireplace and place them along a walking path. Then she went to work. She served breakfast for the Newsom family and continued to clean the home. The family became alarmed when Robert did not come down for breakfast. They searched his room and he wasn't there. The family enlisted the help of neighbors to look for him. After hours of fruitless searching, a neighbor began to suspect the slaves, especially the male slaves. The neighbors interrogated Newsom's slaves. One male slave named George, Celia's boyfriend, revealed that he saw his master the night before walking towards Celia's cabin. When a search of Celia's cabin failed to turn up any sign of Newsom, Celia was called from the main house and questioned. So at this point, no one had even thought of Celia as doing anything until George kind of put the idea in everyone's head. At first, she denied everything, but the neighbor threatened to harm her, and that is when Celia revealed what happened. Despite her full confession, doubts about whether Celia had the physical strength to pull off her crime persisted. How could a small and pregnant woman beat an adult male to death? How could she move his body across the room, lift it into the fireplace, and gather enough wood to keep a fire blazing for 8 hours? Then, after doing all of that, why would she need the grandson's help to dispose of ashes, which did not weigh much at all? Callaway County Sheriff's Office conducted further questioning of Celia, but she always denied that her boyfriend George or any other person helped her kill Newsom or dispose of his body. This actually interested me because those questions actually made me think, could this have been possible for her to do on her own? So I started researching, and the closest thing that I could compare what Celia did and how she disposed of Robert Newsom's body is a Hindu burial ritual where they burned their bodies outside using wood. So a Hindu burial ritual usually takes 6 hours to burn a body and requires 1,300 pounds of wood to do this. Plus, it is often done outside because of the massive amount of carbon dioxide released. So I was thinking, where would Celia get 1,300 pounds of wood to keep this fire going all night long in at least 6 hours to burn all of Robert Newsom? It just seems like once I researched how much effort goes into actually cremating a person using an open flame, I realized it appears to be very difficult. And I think when people were questioning how she was able to do it, I think they understood as well and knew that it would probably have been impossible for her to have done that on her own. So it seems unlikely that she could have done this on her own. Even if George had helped her, the family most likely did not want George punished. He was worth a lot of money. They were already losing one slave who was pregnant. And so having the fact that it could have been more of the family slaves involved meant that the family was going to lose a ton of money. By the mid-1850s, the prices of slaves had reached an all-time high in the United States. So George was one of the slaves who looked like most likely helped Celia, but the family chose, instead of punishing him, to keep him and sell him for a large amount of money. In a shocking turn of events, the police did not put Celia to death immediately. Instead, she was given a trial and a defense team consisting of a lead lawyer and 2 assistant lawyers. And her lawyers were good. Celia was given this legal team due to the political climate at the time. 1 year before the murder, the Mississippi Compromise was replaced by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed white male settlers to determine through voting a state would allow slavery. It essentially removed the ban of slavery in the new territory. So at this point, slavery begins to dominate the headlines, especially in Missouri, who sees this as a chance of spreading slavery around them. So in the mid-1800s, Kansas, which borders Missouri, was petitioning to join the United States. The question was, will it be a free state or a slave state? So pro-slavery people from Missouri tried to influence the Kansas decision by entering Kansas, claiming to be residents, and voting. This caused a series of violent confrontations between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups in Kansas between 1854 and 1859, which became known as Bleeding Kansas, the precursor to the American Civil War that is going to happen within 5 to 6 years. So this trial appears to be an attempt by a slave state to show that slaves were not treated that badly and given opportunities to have a defense. However, during the trial, we see that there was never going to be a fair trial. Celia's legal team never were allowed to actually present any type of defense. They initially tried to present a defense based on Missouri law that allowed women to use deadly force against a person trying to rape them. The judge ordered that the defense could not mention the rape and sexual abuse that Newsom committed against Celia. In almost all American states, free and slave states, black women were excluded from rape laws. No southern state made it legally possible for a slave woman to file rape charges against white men before the Civil War. In desperation to win the Civil War, we see in 1861, slave states in the Confederacy began to give slaves more rights than ever before, including protections for black women. But before 1861, slave women had very few options concerning what to do about rape. They either allowed themselves to be raped or they would fight back. Both options would leave the slave woman damaged mentally, physically, or both. So without bringing up the rape and sexual abuse, Celia's defense fell apart and she was found guilty and sentenced to be hung. But in another shocking twist, Celia escaped from prison. While she went missing, her attorney attempted to get her sentence overturned by filing a motion with the Supreme Court in Missouri. The appeal could never have been successful. Even though the defense made a proper appeal based on Missouri law, there was no way the Supreme Court could rule based solely on the law because of the immediate implications of overturning the verdict. Essentially, this would allow a black woman to murder a white man who raped her. Unsurprisingly, the Missouri Supreme Court considered and rejected Celia's appeal, and she turned herself back into the police. So on December 21st, 1855 at 2:30 p.m., Celia was hanged in Fulton, Missouri. Her case gives excellent insight into slavery and the struggles that female slaves encountered. It also demonstrates how national politics were influencing the lives of slaves. Thank you for watching today's video. If you want to learn more about women that kill, check out some of my other videos. Bye everyone.